Hello, everybody. We are back with another episode. And this one is something that I feel like we hear a lot about it, but I would want to dive a bit deeper into it and clarify more about how thoughts become our beliefs. So maybe what we can start with is to maybe you can explain what are thoughts and what are the beliefs. We can maybe start there.
Okay, this is always exciting for me to find out what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so thoughts. I'm going to remind us that it's often said in self-help and neuroscience now that 90 to 95% of our perceptual awareness is subconscious. So that's the thoughts we think, the words we choose, the habits we create, and the choices we make. Now, so if we start looking at what is a thought, we could go very esoteric, we could go very meta, we could talk about collective consciousness, or what spirituality would call the Akashic records, or what modern physics would call the ether, or the collective consciousness, or the fabric of humanity, the fabric that is the entanglement and quantum entanglement and the information delivery system. We could go there. That might be a pretty heavy topic. So let's just break down thoughts to thoughts or things. Thoughts might be an exploration. It might be a way to look at different perspectives. So it might be, I don't know if you've ever had this, but I know that every client I've ever worked with, and myself included, we have intrusive thoughts. Thoughts like, I wonder what would happen if that person fell off their chair. Or I wonder what would happen if, and sometimes they can be a little dark if we don't just kind of laugh at them. I just call them nonsense thoughts. So we have nonsense thoughts. But a lot of the thoughts we think are part of the software programming in our vehicle of consciousness supercomputer, the brain, that was often installed before the age of 7 when our brain was in theta states. Now, thoughts also can occur as part of a cycle with emotions or feelings. And what I mean by that is a thought, the source of I guess what we're talking about is different sources of thoughts. Another source of thought is your left brain. I read the most fabulous book about this. Your left brain just makes things up. It's a meaning maker. It doesn't like to not know things. So if it doesn't have accurate information about something, it will fill in the blanks. That's why if you have 10 people at an accident site, they will all perceive it completely differently. And that's part of why I say either you train your brain or your brain is training you, because your brain is, I mean this in a humorous way, is a little bit of a lazy liar. So it tries to run old programs efficiently as possible, run old neural pathways, because electricity takes the path of least resistance. And it also fills in blanks because it doesn't like to not know things. So sometimes if we're feeling a certain emotion that we have not identified or released, the thought, the meaning maker, will start making up thoughts or meanings about it. And then those thoughts create more of those emotions, and those emotions create more of those thoughts, and we can end up in a thought loop where they're sort of like triggering each other, and they just sort of get stuck in this thought, feeling, thought, feeling, thought, feeling. So to recap, thoughts can be just part of the quantum buffet of ideas. Think of thoughts like a big giant buffet. It doesn't matter if there's stuff there you don't like. If you don't like it, don't eat it, which is why I always say either you question your thoughts or you believe your thoughts. That's the only options. And every thought that you believe, your brain responds to as if it's true and sends the appropriate chemical reaction into your vehicle of consciousness or your body. So awareness of our thoughts is really, or that's often called metacognition, that awareness, the metacognition of our thoughts is really the biggest and arguably the most important step in healing, self-awareness, evolving, and becoming the pilot of your vehicle of consciousness, or training your brain and mastering your mind. Because without awareness, again, that 90 to 95% is just running kind of on old software and programs that probably were not installed in your highest good.
So with the...
Oh, and also 70%, and this is not an exactly accurate number, but it's often said 70% of the thoughts you think are nonsense. They're absolute nonsense. Thoughts like, my partner doesn't care about me. Nobody appreciates me. I'm terrible at such and such, or I'm really good at so and so, or, half the things, more than half of the thoughts we think are absolute nonsense. So again, awareness or metacognition is really the critical turning point. And then the emotional component I mentioned can be especially strong in men and the men I work with because they have been taught to suppress, avoid, project, deny, or resist their emotions. And so men can get very stuck in these rumination, the thought, feeling, or trying to, the left brain making up meaning of why they have those feelings, because that's a lot easier than going within to the shame or the unpleasant feelings and unpleasant emotions. So again, the brain is just going to make it up and project an external reason for those in the form of thoughts.
Can you give an example of how men go through that thought feeling process?
Yes. Let me think of a specific client example. Now, this is going to get into a little bit of beliefs as well. But I had a client come to me, a very successful C-suite executive, and he was very frustrated. He was becoming overweight because he was eating to self-soothe. He felt agitated, misunderstood, frustrated, unappreciated. And the first thing I did was help him find the tools to practice metacognition, awareness of his thoughts. So he thought over and over in childhood that nobody appreciates him and nobody likes him. And the thoughts we think over and over and over become beliefs. So if you think of your mind like a big wild field of tall grass, and you walk through it one time, you're creating a ripple, you're giving a path for electricity to go. But if you take a lawnmower and through it, when that's what happens when we have a big emotional reaction, all of a sudden to something that happens, we have a thought about it, boom, we have a big lawnmower, or we might just be walking that same path over and over and over. And eventually that becomes a neural pathway. And one of the jobs of our brain is to find evidence of its beliefs, or perceptual filters, I call them. Have you ever heard of the expression rose-colored glasses?
Yeah.
So the thoughts we think over and over become beliefs. Beliefs, let's call them perceptual filters. And basically anything we perceive in our external reality has to come through these layers and layers and layers, or these coatings on our goggles of perception. And those are our perceptual filters. So over time, he had created a belief that he was unappreciated, that nobody understood him. So his brain continuously felt evidence of that, found evidence of that, because that's the brain's job. And we could get into the meta version of why that happens, but that would maybe be for another episode. And there's actually really good logic behind why it would be that way, and how that's very helpful when we're mastering our mind and training our brain. So it didn't matter how many times his company, his friends, his family, and his wife said or did things to show him how much they appreciate him. And he did have some people that very much liked him. But again, his brain would only find evidence of its beliefs. So then he would feel feelings of frustration, disconnect, and those feelings would trigger a thought like, oh, that person's judging me, or nobody appreciates me, or my partner. Now, it might be true that their partner doesn't appreciate them. That's also a possibility. But in this case, his partner actually very much appreciated him and very much liked him and very much went out of her way to show him how much she liked and appreciated and even adored and admired and cherished him. But again, his brain would delete out all of that evidence because everything was not coming through rose-colored glasses. It was coming through what I call poop-colored glasses.
Yeah.
So, and there might be, 5 or 10 or 20 layers that everything that happens in our perceptual reality we experience through those filters, which creates feeling, which create more thought, which create more feeling. And then that becomes a temperament or a lifestyle or a way of being or a pattern or a personality. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So,
and if we don't know that, and we don't know how to question our thoughts or observe our thoughts and challenge our thoughts and rewire those neural pathways, then we're stuck basically in our own version of hell or a nightmare. And you can change those over time, and you can create sort of clear filters so you're seeing things for what they are, rather than in this reactive mode based on thoughts that happened, when you were 6 years old.
okay. So I have quite a few questions here.
Okay.
So
That was maybe a lot at once. Was that a lot at once? I apologize.
no, I think it is good. I think it is good. So with the buffet of thoughts,
Yeah.
So you said that we either question or believe our thoughts.
Mhm.
What is the process of maybe unconscious when we don't question or we don't question or we believe them versus maybe conscious where we are aware, kind of understanding difference between those, because otherwise I think how can we know which thoughts to question if we don't even know the whole process?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. And I would invite you to be aware that awareness itself is the first step to awareness. So I guess awareness of awareness is the first step, and we can congratulate that. So that we're even like aware of awareness. Wait, what? I don't have to believe my thoughts? No. And most 95% of those thoughts are not being questioned. They're not in metacognition. You're in the program, not programming the programmer. You're strapped into the back seat of that vehicle of consciousness we talked about a couple of episodes ago. You're strapped into the back seat of that vehicle of consciousness, and it's taking you on a joyride rather than piloting it or driving it in a direction that creates a more fulfilling life. And the buffet of thoughts, again, we could get really meta or esoteric and talk about where thoughts come from, but think of it like you're a radio, and there's lots of different channels and thoughts in the collective. And what quote unquote mood you're in, or what pattern you're in, or how much or how little entropy you're experiencing. We know that we're made out of energy. This is not woo-woo stuff. This is pretty logical. So that determines sort of what set of thoughts you're going to tune into. So if you're really down on yourself and you're feeling not good enough and you're frustrated and your wife and your kids don't appreciate you and you're not getting paid enough at work and you don't like your job, the buffet of thoughts is going to be kind of not a buffet that would be fit for a king. Right? You're going to get a buffet of lousy thoughts, and you're going to have to start slowly shifting those. You're not going to go from 0 to hero, but at first you're just going to try to become aware of your thoughts. And you're going to celebrate every time you become aware of your thoughts, and you can write them down. You can then challenge them and ask yourself, is this thought true? Does this thought provide me energy, or does this thought drain me of energy? What are alternative or opposing thoughts that could also be true? Maybe I could give you an example of this. Would that be helpful? I have another case study because I've done this presentation to large corporations and corporate presentations and such. So I had another client come to me, a very successful entrepreneur, and he was very frustrated, overwhelmed. He was starting to drink a lot. He was starting to be a little bit spicy to his family and a little bit rude to his employees. And he had been referred to me. And when he was telling me that he had these buildings that weren't selling, that were tying up millions of dollars in capital and costing a lot of overhead every month, and he had not been able to sell them, and it was getting quite serious. So we can acknowledge that that is a very stressful situation. Let's call that 40 units of stress.
Out of how many?
Just you'll
Okay.
see.
Okay.
So we'll call that 40 units of stress.
Okay.
But what he was experiencing was 400 units of stress because of his thoughts. So the first thing I asked him to do was to spend time that week becoming aware of and writing down his thoughts. And he was like, I thought you were supposed to be some genius at this. What are you talking about? It has nothing to do with my thoughts. Look how stressful my life is. And I was like, okay, just bear with me. This doesn't work. No charge for this session. So he spent the week, came back to me. His thoughts were, he thought about 50 to 100 times a day, this is an effing nightmare. I'm ruined. I will never recover from this. I am a failure. My family must be ashamed of me. I let my family down. I'm never going to sell these buildings. Now, your brain must react to thoughts that you believe, so the ones that are below the level of your awareness, and create a chemical signal that says, okay, yep, that's what this feels like. I believe you. And think, just even me saying those things out loud, my whole body went rigid. My stomach felt a little tight. My breathing got a little bit constricted. Now, so again, yes, it was a stressful situation. Let's call that 40 units of stress. But you see how those thoughts alone, hundreds of times a day, could quite literally destroy somebody. And I ask you right now, Austra, are any of those thoughts true?
Well, I guess it depends
Not really.
on, yeah.
Or, and then, so we're not going to go from that to mantras like everything is perfect. You know, we're not going to be able to go from 0 to hero. So what I had him do was think thoughts or choose thoughts. Notice when those thoughts came up, celebrate the awareness, and then choose thoughts like, I have been able to create a multi-million-dollar business before. I have proof that I can do it. Therefore, I can probably do it again. That's true. My family loves me. That's true. My family wants me to be happy. I'm proud of myself that I am navigating this very challenging situation and that I'm reaching out for help from a coach. I am excited for somebody to buy this building and create their dream company. And I'm excited for them to come in and experience that because this is going to be the perfect location for somebody. I am going to drink more water tomorrow and not have as many beers because I want energy to come up with creative solutions. So all of those thoughts were completely draining him, disconnecting him from his intuition, and he didn't have any energy left over for creative problem solving. And I have a dozen examples like this where people's problems were actually mostly in the thought. I call this the what if game. And I do this with myself. I'm like, what if this podcast flops? What if nobody thinks it's helpful? What if I say something careless that might cause somebody to have damage? Or what if my whole coaching business fails? Or what if I break my leg? Or what if I can't pay for my retirement? Or what if? So, and all of those thoughts, again, are not only aligning us, if we want to go into the law of attraction or whatever, which we can do another episode of if it's helpful, but let's keep it practical. Those thoughts are draining my energy. They might be true, but so might, what if this podcast helps one person? What if my fear of being seen and putting myself out there prevents me from connecting with the men who are the evolutionary leaders that are helping redefine what it means to be a man, redefining masculinity, and stepping into the power of magnetic masculinity, which is going to trickle down in their company, their family, their personal life, their professional life, and everybody that has the pleasure of coming in contact with them. So if we're going to play the what if game, let's be conscientious about it. Now, if we have one of those fears, I personally do not believe in suppressing it. I like to bring it up and examine that fearful thought, like a thought like, what if a lot of men tell me they're afraid, like, what if thoughts of imposter syndrome? What if people are judging me? Or what if I lose my hair? Or what if I get erectile dysfunction? Or what if my wife leaves me? Or what if, what if, what if? And those thoughts are so scary that we suppress them or we hyper focus on them, one or the other. We either, oh gosh, suppress them and they go to the subconscious where and what we resist persists, or where they actually get bigger, or we ruminate on them, get fixated on them, and create a neural pathway. So then electricity is just going to keep taking that pathway, because the electricity isn't judging whether it's helpful or unhelpful. It's just taking the path of least resistance that we have created by thinking that thought over and over, and therefore creating that neural pathway. So why, if we're going to play the what if game, why not play the what if game of helpful things? But in order to do that, let's look at the really scary, dark thoughts, laugh at them. So we can either laugh at them like, that's a ridiculous nonsense thought. That takes the power away, and that means that the ego is not getting a payoff from it. Or we can look at those thoughts and challenge them. Okay, what if this podcast fails? And again, that's not like my biggest concern in the world. I'm just using it as an example. I could think of worse fears, I'm sure. But I actually don't have a lot of fears because I do apply this in my life. And we face that worst case scenario. Okay, what if I do end up homeless? What if I do lose my hair? What if I do get erectile dysfunction? And we jump into that fear thought and experience it or process it. And I do this a lot with clients until it no longer has a charge or a trigger. Then it's just a nonsense thought that doesn't create that physical reaction in our body. So we do that. We face those fear thoughts. Then we start shifting from 0 to hero by playing the what if game.
So,
and then, or we make a conscious choice to think a thought over and over and over, even if we don't believe it. Because remember, in this case, you can fake it till you become it. You're just thinking that thought over and over and over because you've already dealt with any resistance. That's the step most people miss, in my experience. You deal with the resistance first, and then you just make a conscious choice to do it differently over and over and over and over, as many times as it takes, until that becomes your new subconscious baseline belief, and therefore perceptual filter.
So going even like one step back with kind of bringing up those scary thoughts, what are some things that might get in the way of even bringing them up? Because once they're up, then you explain what we can do, but what are some of the things that are getting in the way of bringing them up and how to overcome or face them?
Well, and this again is especially challenging for men because those thoughts can often bring a flood of emotions that they have not been trained or given the tools to process safely, and it sort of overwhelms their system, which is often where projection comes in, or like emotional hot potato. Like a feeling comes up from a thought, they don't know how to process that feeling and let it move through them, that energy in motion or emotion. They either stuff that. We talked before that emotions can be like a beach ball inflated with air, and we push it under the surface, or we take it and throw it at somebody else and deflect it. So in order to feel uncomfortable thoughts, or in order to examine uncomfortable thoughts, it can also be helpful to understand and tell yourself ahead of time, hey, with this thought, my brain, because it currently believes this thought, is going to send a chemical signal through my body that I'm going to experience as an uncomfortable emotion, and it's going to be a sensation in my body. I'm going to be safe, and the sensation is going to pass. So it's mentally preparing ourselves and feeling safe and sort of logicking through it and making it less scary by saying, it's literally a sensation. It's a chemical sensation that my brain is creating. Same as when you think about like, oh, my partner is so hot, or oh God, I would love having a new Tesla, or whatever. Those thoughts give us a rush of good feelings. So it's just a sensation in your body. And this is something I tell men, not to diminish the power of emotions, but just to help us logic through experiencing them. So you're probably going to have an unpleasant sensation in your avatar, your vehicle of consciousness, your body, pick your metaphor, they're all valid. And it's going to feel uncomfortable, and it's going to pass. And reminding yourself that you are safe, and remembering that your brain is trying to, again, we're grossly oversimplifying neuroscience, your brain is trying to seek pleasure. So it's like, don't go over there where it's hard. Let's just scroll Twitter, or let's check our email, or let's eat another plate of French fries, or let's eat another beer, or let's go for another run, or let's listen to a podcast, or anything to distract us from that discomfort. You have to make a conscious choice to go into that discomfort reminding yourself that you're safe, reminding yourself that really it's just a chemical sensation that's going to pass through your avatar. It's a chemical reaction, and then it's going to pass. And then we kind of, and remember too that the brain, so the brain is seeking pleasure, avoiding pain. So it's trying to avoid that discomfort, and it wants to run the same, it's electricity, so and a computer, so it wants to run the programs it knows and take the neural pathways that are the path of least resistance. So understanding how our body and our brain work, to me, I find it very logical and empowering, and then I feel safer to go into the discomfort. Does that make sense? And then I make a conscious choice and I tell myself, hey, I know I have not been ready to feel these things earlier, but let's jump into all the thoughts. Can you think of a thought where, like, thinking that thought, you instantly go, oh God, nope, not there. I'm not going there. I'm not going there. That's exactly and specifically where you want to go. And it can be very helpful to have somebody, you can definitely do it on your own, or this is something that I do guide people through a lot, and just create that safe place to feel those emotions without blaming them on anybody else. They often say we can't feel what we can't heal what we won't feel. So the reason I'm bringing emotions into this, even though we'll do a whole separate episode about that, is that these thoughts really do trigger the emotions that we're trying to avoid, and vice versa. But if we can understand how they're working and understand the relationship, it's a lot easier to navigate through them in that brain optimization or program restructuring.
So speaking even with that like relationship, what is, even like going a step further, how does our beliefs, when we create them, what role does play internal versus external? Because what you mentioned before about meaning making brain,
Yeah.
what happens kind of happens, and then we add meaning to it. But what are the role of external versus internal? Like how does that happen?
That's a great question. That's a couple of questions, I think. And if I don't give you a satisfactory answer, then please ask again. So yes, the meaning maker, that's a whole different layer. And we're going to talk about that right now. So the meaning maker actually has some to do with what we talked about with the brain finding evidence of what it believes. For instance, when my partner doesn't make me a cup of tea when he has a cup of tea or whatever, I make it mean he doesn't consider me. Or here's a good one. I had a client come to me, married for 30 years, very successful entrepreneur, or very successful executive, PhD, very much struggling in his marriage. Now, he had a core belief that he wasn't good enough and that nobody appreciated him. So every day he would come home from work at 6, 7, 8, usually 7 or 8, and his wife would have made dinner for the kids, put the kids to bed, and then waited to have dinner with him. But she never asked him how his day was or how his interactions were with the other people at work. And he made that mean that his wife didn't care about him. And that feeling of my wife doesn't care about me was excruciating, right? And that caused a decade of suffering and resenting his wife. Now, that's also another episode in the future where we're going to talk about our authentic wants, needs, boundaries, and values. But in this case, that thought that was created because he had that belief or that perceptual filter prevented him from experiencing thoughts like, wow, my wife cares about me and appreciates me so much that she waits till I come home from work to eat a meal with me. But because he wasn't aware of his thoughts until I talked through it with him, and he made those actions mean that she didn't care about him. You see the correlation then, and he'd think thoughts like, my wife doesn't appreciate me, my wife doesn't think of me, she doesn't consider me, she doesn't value what I do. And those thoughts were what were causing his suffering. Now, was her behavior always in alignment with what he would prefer? Probably not. But I asked him, again, this is for another episode, I asked him, did you ever tell her that you wanted her to exactly and specifically do X, Y, and Z when you came home? And he's like, well, no, she should have known. But my suspicion is that even if she had done that, his brain would have deleted any evidence that did not support its beliefs. It just wouldn't have focused the light of our awareness on it. It would have focused on other things, twisted it around, made it mean something that reinforced, see, that belief I have is right.
So in this case, that would be kind of creating that meaning, or like having that like internal interpretation of what happened externally. But what happens, let's say, if I don't know, someone externally calls you out on, I don't know, being fat, or and
Okay, that's a great
then you
example.
create meaning based on external. Like, how does that look like?
Okay, so external, again, I'm going to bring it back to our perceptual filters, Austra. And what I mean by that is, let's say 4 people have the exact same experience. I'll use your example, and then I'll use another example, so that that examples or stories really help our brain sort of create new mind models. So if you called me fat, I don't have a belief that I'm fat. I don't have a wound around that. I have been overweight, and now I'm a really fantastic ideal weight. But either way, if you called me fat and I didn't have a core wound or thought or belief that I was, it wouldn't hurt me. I'd just be like, I actually had a partner say to me once, "You're getting quite fat." And I was like, "Yeah, you're right. I am getting quite fat." Yeah. I was like, that is a factual information. It didn't trigger me or upset me. And again, we'll do a whole episode about triggers, because I think if you actually write that down, that will be a good episode for you to surprise me with sometime. Triggers are a really important one. So, and if you were somebody who was afraid of being fat in childhood, or were called fat, or you had a program or a negative belief about people that were experiencing a lot of fat on their body, like your parents were like, "Oh, look at those fatties," or "Oh, they're fat people are weak," or whatever, you would have a software program or a belief or a perceptual filter that that is bad or wrong. And therefore, if somebody called you that, you would make it mean you were bad or wrong, and you would shame collapse. And then it would feel excruciating. So there's also that layer of the perceptual filters or the wounds. Now, I'll use another example. You could have 4 people get in a car accident, a fender bender. One person might be like, "What an a-hole. How could that person do that? What an idiot. How could he have hit my car? My day's ruined." There's one way to perceive that based on the software that's running, your perceptual filters and your emotions, and that feedback loop you're in, and what you're projecting about your internal reality onto what happens externally. It's not necessarily the external stimulus, it's your perception and experience of it. A second person might be like, "Oh, figures I'd get in a car accident. I always get the worst things always happen to me. The universe is out to get me. My life sucks. I probably deserved it." Okay. A third person could get in that same fender bender and think, "This is really inconvenient. I don't prefer this. Let me get their information and be kind of kind to them." But just sort of be like, "Okay, let's just exchange information. This shit happens. What are you going to do?" And then a fourth person, and this is something I have experienced in my own life because I have created very good perceptual filters and baseline and programming in my vehicle of consciousness. The other person could be like, "Oh my gosh, I hope the other person's okay. I know how much this might impact the other person. Have I been impacted? They are probably feeling terrible about it. I know nobody wants to get in a car accident. Maybe they were on their way somewhere important. Let me go see if I can offer them a bit of kindness and compassion, because nobody intended for this to happen, and it just happens. And let me just make sure that, that I'm supportive to everybody involved." Right? So the external stimulus is valid, but our reaction to it and our perception of it has a lot to do with these emotions that we've suppressed or not felt, as well as the software of the mind and our beliefs or perceptual filters and our meaning maker. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And with external, question also would be about when we create beliefs, not necessarily, let's say, if they something, that fat example, whether it triggers, but I'm just trying to understand whether we create beliefs internally or externally. Because if, let's say, somebody as a kid, they grow up and they hear something externally about themselves, does that create belief, or does it come from
Definitely.
like internal?
So both. The answer, it's a very good question. The answer is both. So before the age of 7, our brain is in what's called a theta state typically, or it can bounce into other even slightly different states, but just for the sake of a metaphorical alignment. And think of that like an open computer that's just taking in software. It's not yet assessing whether things are true or untrue. So if somebody tells you you're fat or you're gross or you're stupid or you're not good enough or you're lazy, don't be so sensitive, don't be so dramatic. Oh, stop crying and go to your room. Oh no, you're not as good at sports as your brother. Your brain stores that in, and that becomes the software that definitely impacts which thoughts we're going to align with in our buffet, or which thoughts we're going to have in our buffet to choose from. Or we also have that little meaning maker. So if our sister or brother gets 5 presents and we get 2 presents, our little brains, because our little brains when we're children are self-centered. It's not a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with being self-centered if you're aware of it. Most humans are. Then you might make it mean that your sister or brother is better than you, or that your parents love them more. You could also grow up in a family who were taught and therefore passing on to you racism or judgment of a certain culture, or hey, only losers don't get straight A's, or whatever their beliefs are. So half the things that we think, half the things we believe, and half the things we perceive might not even remotely connect to our authentic alignment. It's just junk software. And we probably get some great software too. And we probably get some okay software that just needs a bit of an update. So it can be external. Like if you grow up a child and you don't see like a female of color or something, and you never see yourself represented on TV, you might make it mean that you're gross or bad or wrong. Or if you're a man and you never see your father cry, and you start crying once and somebody says to you, hey, toughen up, don't cry, you'll then think that anybody who's crying is weak or scary or bad or wrong, and you will create these self-concepts and these beliefs. And you might make it mean that you are weak for crying, and then you're going to have a perceptual filter that crying is bad and wrong. So it's A and B. It can be A or it can be B, and it can be A and B, chicken, egg, chicken, egg, chicken, egg.
Is it important to, if we start to look into our thoughts and beliefs, is it important for us to know which one they're coming from?
No, not at all. You don't have to know where it came from. You can if you want. Like one of the tools for metacognition that works for some people is every time you think a thought or say something, ask yourself, whose is that? Who does that sound like? And you're like, oh, actually, that's my mom or my dad. But if they have behaviors that we don't prefer, then we become blind to those. Those become our blind spots, which we'll talk about when we're doing shadow work and such. So we won't get too deep into that in this episode because we're already giving quite a lot of information, but it can. Does that answer your question, sort of?
Yeah. And then probably last question would be, what would be the importance of paying attention to our thoughts, or even like challenging them? Yeah, go ahead.
One moment. Okay, here's what I was going to say. Here's the relief. You don't have to know whose it is. It's just that is one tool that can help people develop the skill of metacognition. It is a skill. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes practice, and it takes a bunch of failures. You're going to go unconscious. I call it unconscious, like, whoop, you're not going to be in that state of awareness. This is what, many Buddhist and religious and self-help and spirituality and mystic and philosophy tools are all designed to help us with. But it's not necessarily as challenging as we might think it is. But it does require conscious effort. I have lots of different tools and strategies for that, and I can actually help accelerate it very quickly. But you don't have to know where it came from. You don't have to know who started it. It's nobody's fault. It's just identifying what software is helpful that you want to keep, what software is not helpful, and learning to become aware of your thoughts. And then pausing, saying, how does this thought feel in my body? And then playing the what if game. Is that thought true? What would the opposite thought be? What could a different thought be? And then just doing that over and over and over. That's also where the concept of mantras comes in, right? It's like you put a little sticky note on your mirror saying, I am safe and abundant, or whatever. And the reason those sometimes don't work is if you think, first of all, if you haven't dealt with the resistance, the parts of you that are like, I'm not safe, I'm not abundant, if you haven't dealt with the resistance first, what we resist persists. So then we're actually just becoming more blind to it, and it's staying in the subconscious. And we want to bring that 90 to 95% of the subconscious into the light of our awareness. So deal with the resistance first. But if you have that mantra on your sticker on your mirror, you say it 5 times a day, but you think, oh God, the gas is so expensive. Oh, people at work don't appreciate me. If you think those things 900 times a day, which neural pathway are you reinforcing, or how long is it going to take you to create a parallel path to that one?
Yeah.
And if it's a mantra that you're trying to go from 0 to hero, then that's a pretty big energetic jump. But yeah, it's starting to just look at and observe your thoughts with a sense of humor. When you go unconscious, or all of a sudden you're like, oh, I was believing those thoughts again. As soon as you become aware, celebrate the awareness, train your brain, reward your brain, celebrate every time you're in awareness, laugh at the thoughts, ask yourself questions about the thoughts. And eventually the brain is going to start seeking metacognition because you're rewarding it, because it feels good. And you're like, whoa, good job. I'm aware. Oh my gosh, look at that. I just went unconscious and lashed out at my wife. Look at that. I'm now in awareness. I'm not in the unconscious thoughts. I can now start to play the what if game. I can now start to question, challenge, and choose my thoughts. And I can make a conscious choice to do it differently over and over and over, as many times as it takes, as many failures as it takes, to reprogram that thought, create new beliefs, new perceptual filters, or at least wipe off the poop-colored layers that we're perceiving our external reality around.
Yeah. This is like really good summary, I think, of the whole conversation and the key points to to keep in mind. And as always, if you have any questions, you can leave them. We have left a link where you can ask any questions. And the moment we get your questions, we will do Q&As with Sandy. So please, it doesn't have to be only about topics that we talk about in the episodes. It can be pretty much like any question that you feel you want us to address or talk about, because that's what this podcast is about, adding value to you, helping you on your journey. Anything you want to add before we go?
No, I just want to remind all men, or anybody else that's listening of any gender, ruminating thoughts are normal. Intrusive thoughts are normal. Everybody has intrusive, nonsense, obnoxious thoughts. I have fathers tell me things all the time that they think about their children or things they think about their wife. And I'm like, well, do you believe it or act on it? If you don't act on it, they're just nonsense thoughts. Don't be afraid of your thoughts. That's one of the mistakes we make when we discover the power of thoughts. I see that commonly, is that we become afraid of our thoughts, then we resist them, then they stay in the subconscious. We want to be lighthearted, playful, curious, compassionate, and patient. And trust me, eventually, there's almost no thought in a day that gets past my awareness. And but I didn't get there overnight.
Yeah.
And don't believe everything you think. Please don't believe everything you think, because most of the things you think are nonsense.
Question your thoughts and your beliefs.
Yes, question, challenge, and choose your thoughts.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and we will see you next week.
I look forward to it. Thanks so much, Austra.